Okay, great.
And without further ado, thank you so much, Christina Gantry, for joining us, Gentle Sleep coach. And you've been a frequent presenter here, and we really appreciate your guidance. And it's always interesting to hear kind of all the things that are involved with a healthy night's sleep and for all of us. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Susan. Thank you for hosting me back again in the community. So I have titled this talk Becoming Sleep Smart, which I've definitely evolved over time, because these days we can call it, becoming sleep smart is really what you need to know about sleep because you've exhausted the Google search engine, right? You've gotten to the end, needless to say, as well as yourself. So we're going to go over the basics that I think are really, really useful for all parents of young children to know in terms of sleep, how it works, why we do the things we do, and why your children do the things they do, needless to say, in terms of sleep, and how to improve upon any challenging situations we might find ourselves in. So there are a number of myths that I face uh, whenever I'm speaking to parents about their child's sleep. The first one, and I encounter it constantly, is that, my baby is 12 weeks and 12 pounds and they should be sleeping 12 hours. There's just no scientific proof behind that. There's no reason they should. That babies, another myth is very commonly held still to this day, that babies will start sleeping through the night when they start solids. Nope. There's no reason that that would happen. Food doesn't make us sleep. And I will say that is very much based on about 6 months of age. Many babies start solids, and that's about the age when many babies are capable of learning to put themselves to sleep and put themselves back to sleep more consistently than previous months. And the last most commonly held myth I find is that, well, I'll put my baby to sleep later, and so they'll sleep later in the morning. And unfortunately, that is just highly logical, but that is not the science of how sleep works, particularly with young children. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of those really commonly held myths, let's get to some information. So if there's only one thing you remember in this talk, because you're very tired, I want you to always remember that the skill of falling asleep is a learned skill, and that some of our children will have an easy time learning how to do that, and some will just have a more challenging time. Sleep is a neurological development, and most babies are ready to sleep longer stretches around 6 months. Now, that doesn't mean all babies won't. It's just that that's a good benchmark to hold in terms of what you can expect from your child. And also, I like to point out that many people have different definitions of what it means to sleep through the night. So I'll hear from parents all the time. My baby's 4.5 months old, and when she was 2 months old, she slept through the night. And I say, really? She didn't wake up at all? And they'll say, well, no, she woke up, she had a feeding or two, and then went back to sleep. So that parent's definition of sleeping through the night may be baby still wakes up for 2 night feedings. My definition may be very different from that. So I think it's just important to point out, because many of us have different definitions of what sleeping through the night for a child may look like. Okay, let's talk about some sleep science. So while it's a fantastic phrase, the idea of sleeping through the night is a misnomer. The truth is, nobody sleeps through an entire night. We all wake up and have to put ourselves back to sleep several times every night. And that's because we basically have two kinds of sleep in our brain, essentially deep sleep and active or light sleep. And so we transition like a car shifting gears several times throughout a night's sleep, from bedtime until the morning. And so it's not that we are going to completely sleep through that and never wake up. We do. The issue is that we will put ourselves back to sleep several times a night. And in terms of the architecture of sleep, as I like to call it, it's helpful to understand that bedtime onset is like the template. Okay, bedtime is when we're the most prime, our body's the most ready to go to sleep. So we tend to see children will make progress in terms of learning how to fall asleep at bedtime. Then they can replicate working from that template at night wakings. And then they will be able to learn how to nap better once bedtime and nighttime are more solid. Okay, so sleep will progress from bedtime onset through night wakings and then with daytime sleep. Okay, and while that may seem counterintuitive because we think, oh, tomorrow's a new day, I'm going to start this new habit. Sleep starts at night, right? It starts in the evening, progresses overnight, and it then goes to the next day. So I highlight this because when we want to make changes for our baby or child, we want to start with those changes at bedtime, then go through the night and tackle any night wakings, and then deal with naps last. Okay, so many parents come to me with a lot of different issues, but ultimately many of them are very, very similar. The one I hear most often is my baby goes to sleep very easily, but wakes a lot at night. So I'm dealing with a lot of night wakings. The second one is that, my baby needs to be rocked or nursed to sleep and go back to sleep all night long. Another one is that parents get into the habit of co-sleeping or holding their child to sleep. And that's not necessarily what they wanted to do, sort of at the outset or the onset of having a child, but they are sort of reactively co-sleeping because they're not quite sure how else to survive those first few weeks and months and potentially years. And then I would say the last thing in terms of the most common issues I face with parents is that children are having a tough time napping, whether it's a very young baby or a toddler. Naps and daytime sleep can definitely be a big challenge and sometimes feel harder than nights because, if you feel like my child doesn't nap all day, therefore I can get nothing done, in some ways that feels much harder to some parents than having frequent night wakings. So what's normal? Because many parents will say to me, well, I don't know, is this normal or not? I'm not really sure what to expect in terms of my child and where they are, especially in comparison to, everything I see out there on social media and even in my sort of group of friends or family. So the age of your baby is going to be an important part of what your baby or child is capable of with respect to sleep development. And some of that is that sleep, like many other processes in human development, goes along a timeline. And there are certain things that young infants will be capable of and many that they're not. And then, of course, as I said before, there's a benchmark of that sort of 6-month mark where we see a lot of babies are capable of learning and remembering things in a way that they just weren't able to, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks before that 6-month mark. And so I'm always asking parents of young babies, especially, was your child born full term? Because it's not that children who are born preterm aren't capable. It's just that if a baby, let's say, is born 3 to 4 weeks ahead of their full term date, maybe it takes them a little bit longer to go through some of the development in terms of sleep that, let's say, the child next door who was born at 40 weeks would be capable of. I also ask parents always whether there are any medical conditions that might be standing in the way of your baby sleeping easily. Some of them are reflux, right? Reflux is acid reflux, painful acid reflux is something that definitely stands in the way of a child being flat and sleeping easily. Are there any ENT difficulties? Is there any history of anemia in the family? All of those things can play a part in why it might be challenging for a child to sleep easily on a regular basis. And so while I'm screening for all of that, I'm also obviously referring out for any of those conditions that I think might be standing in the way that are physiological, not behavioral. Again, in terms of what's normal, the American Academy of Pediatrics, whose guidelines I follow, will state that babies under 6 months may not have regular sleep patterns. So that's not to say that all babies won't have regular sleep patterns. It's that many won't, and that's okay. In our data-driven world, many of us want to see the numbers, whether it's hours in a certain type of sleep, active sleep versus deep sleep, or hours per day. I highlight this because there's a big range of what is normal and that's okay. Also, in terms of just broad strokes, the AAP will say that, an average of anywhere from 17 to 14 hours of sleep a day for a child under 12 months is average and normal, and that's okay. So that's a big variance, but that's all right. Okay. And I really like to point out that looking at your child or baby's mood is actually a much better indicator of whether they're getting enough sleep rather than subscription-based apps. And I say that because so many parents are coming to me these days saying, the Owlet is telling me that my child isn't getting enough deep sleep. And Huckleberry is telling me my child isn't getting enough sleep. And I really want to encourage parents to look at the mood of their child. Is your baby cranky and irritable a lot? Okay, maybe they're not getting enough sleep. Do they seem pretty happy and content and very bushy-tailed and wide-eyed? Okay, they're probably doing well. So in our data-driven world, I really want parents to look at their baby and child more than their apps. So even though I said there is no sleeping through the night, we're going to go through a little bit more. We're going to dive into that a little bit more here, because obviously we know that there is this capacity to put yourself to sleep and sleep very, very long stretches after a certain age, right? So even though there isn't any sleeping through the night, if your child is to do that, it's because they know how to fall asleep at bedtime, then replicate that behavior at night wakings, and then do that same thing at nap time, right? So that's consistent behavior. And in terms of things that upset sleeping through the night, developmental leaps are a big one, right? Parents will say to me, oh, my child, again, as I said before, my baby's used to sleep through the night and I don't know what I did wrong or what's going on, but now she's up every 2 to 3 hours. Well, if she's going through a big developmental leap, it's very possible that that's the only reason. There may have been no change on your part, but your child may be very different from who they were a few weeks or months ago. So what we teach our child to do at bedtime is what they're going to want to replicate throughout. In terms of naps, because with the toddler and preschool community, that's a lot of what I'm helping parents with. Really, most children under 3 years old need regular naps because they just need to fill that sort of sleep requirement over a 24-hour basis. And naps and nighttime sleep will work together in terms of quality and some of quantity as well. And so it becomes chicken and egg. Sometimes, toddlers have a struggle with naps because their nights aren't so solid. And sometimes nights aren't so solid because a child isn't napping well or napping long enough. So after a certain age, they definitely impact each other. And I find that as our children are getting older through those toddler and preschool years, that can be a big struggle for us as parents, right? My child is protesting and just will not nap. They definitely go on nap strike at different points. And that doesn't mean it's going to last forever, but it can be really challenging when we're in those times. So naps are definitely an important piece of the sleep puzzle for the first 3 years. And so what do we do in terms of solutions? So I would say there are a few things that I speak to parents about on a very regular basis in terms of how to get out of different sleep challenges and get to a better place for everyone in the family. The first one I would say is crib acclimatization. What does that mean? Most of us at some point will get into the habit of having our child fall asleep in our arms and then transfer them into the crib. At some point, that stops working, right? Because your child becomes more alert and mature and notices, wait, I'm waking up in this crib by myself. I don't understand how I got here because I was in daddy's arms. So could you please get me out of here? Put me back in your arms so I can go to sleep. Okay. The way to help your child get familiar with their sleep space, because that's really important, is acclimating them every day for a few minutes. Even though it seems counterintuitive, because many parents will say, well, I don't want it to be play space. Their crib is not their play space, but we definitely want it to be normal and familiar. And so the way you get your child familiar with their crib is to put them there for a few minutes. I literally mean 3, 4, 5 minutes every day, maybe even twice a day, just for short intervals to say, hey, this is your crib. Why don't you hang out here? I'm going to make my bed, fold some laundry, and then we'll go do something else. So making it a familiar place is going to really help when it's bedtime and they have to separate into that place. Okay, so acclimatization is a really important and fundamental piece of changing a sleep challenge. The second thing that I often coach parents through is assessing whether night feeds are necessary or a sleep habit, right? So potentially for the first 6 months, certainly the first 4 months, infants need to eat frequently at night, not uncommon at all. And I would say it's pretty unusual for a child under 4 months, to go the night without feeding. By or at 6 months, they may be able to go the whole night without a feeding. But after that 6-month mark, unless there's a medical difficulty, most children don't need to eat at night at all from bedtime until the morning. And so it's often important to assess, does my child need to eat at night, or is it just a habit, which of course may be physiological because they're used to getting food at certain hours every night. But at some point, it also becomes behavioral. I can fall asleep because I know that wonderful, comforting feeling of feeding to sleep. In terms of the most important thing to do is being consistent about sleep association at all sleep times. So as I said before, forging that template at bedtime, being able to do that same thing at night wakings, and then following through with naps. Those 3 pieces of the puzzle, doing the same thing for your child, really important, because most of us get to a place at some point where, well, at bedtime, my child's so tired, she just falls asleep nursing. Then she wakes up in the middle of the night and I know she doesn't need to eat. So I just pat her back to sleep. But then at 4 a.m., I can't take it and I take her into my bed. So that's an example of inconsistency, right? Because that child is learning 3 different associations: bedtime, night wakings, and naps, which are all different behaviors. In terms of sleep coaching methods, I know that there are many, many thousands of books out there about sleep coaching for your child. If you were to really distill it down, the 3 main coaching methods that you will find are extinction, which means cry it out; time checks, some people call Ferber; and then camping out, or the chair method. Those 3 tend to be the most commonly used sleep coaching methods for young children. Extension being cry it out, meaning I put my child down and I don't go back in the room until the morning. It can be very challenging. It can be very effective. but it's not for everyone for sure. Time checks, which is also called graduated extinction sometimes, can be very helpful for very alert, high energy children, where you're basically checking on your child and gradually increasing intervals, sort of supporting them with your verbal reassurance, to say, you're okay, I'm here, but it's time for you to go to sleep, and leaving, so that they spend more time calming themselves rather than depending on you for a lot of physical or verbal input. And then lastly, camping out, or what some people call the chair method, is basically staying with your child, supporting them, and then gradually over several night increments, moving out of the room so that your child is doing more and more on their own, but getting a lot of support in the process. Um, Also, in terms of solutions for our older children, our toddlers and preschool age children, I often suggest the use of something like a clock, a developmentally appropriate clock. There's a lot of them out there today. People can also use something like the Hatch, which is a great sort of visual cue in terms of time and color. Visual schedules can be really helpful for toddlers and preschool age children to help them understand what we do, our routine every single night, what we expect, what they can be responsible for as they get older, right, in terms of bedtime routine. And then one thing that I really like to use, especially for the older children, is a stop sign. Something, if your child is coming in and out of the room a lot, a stop sign right outside their room or on your door if they're coming into your room a lot, because those visual cues can be really helpful when they're feeling overwhelmed and half asleep, half awake, to sort of remind them, oh, this is what I have to do, or I have to stop. Okay, so those are all things that I suggest in different toddler and preschool age child sleep plans. And so, of course, if all else fails, you're always welcome to get in touch with me. You can look me up on my website, goodnightsleepcoaching.com, and reach out to me with questions and concerns. And now I would love to give the opportunity for questions, because Q&A tends to be a big reason why so many families join us during this time.